Chapter 14. The girls led me upstairs but no one spoke. It felt stifling in the house, which it never had before, so I knew then that whatever they had uncovered was something pretty fucking bad. We turned right and went down the hall to the office where the girls had covered the floor in a plastic tarp. There must have still been some of that stuff there from when we moved in, and they'd made a nice little workstation with a big pot of the wasabi solution and a few paintbrushes. The solution smelled slightly of ammonia and wasabi, and it burned the back of my nose as I stepped into my office. I coughed a few times as the girls crouched down around the notebook, which had been held open with a rock. The wizard's translations only went so far, Sybil sighed. They were very good, but he didn't finish the work before. Well, you know. And I can speak the vampire language, Imelda said, so I can translate some of it more accurately. I'm not sure I like where this is going, I said. Hank, this is going to change everything, Tabitha said and patted the tarp next to her. Sit down with us. I crouched down and joined the girls on the floor so that we were all gathered around the notebook. Once I was seated, Sybil carefully removed the rock from the pages and flipped through until she found another slightly more dry page that had been smothered with the green goo. Here, she said. Take a look at this. She passed me the book, but it was hard to ignore the fumes that stung the back of my nose. Since the girls didn't seem so affected by the wasabi paste, I assumed it was because of my wolf senses. Geez, I muttered as I wiped away a tear. Sorry about the smell, Sybil murmured, but we haven't found a less stinky way to reveal the ink. See, Tabitha teased. Melchior's version was barely noticeable, but her potion smells just as bad as she does. Obviously the cipher was more clever than our witch. You got me there, Tabitha, Sybil said and rolled her eyes. The girls giggled, but it all sounded very forced. There was nothing light or funny about their interaction, and Imelda was biting her lip like she was waiting for something bad to happen. So what am I looking at? I mumbled as I focused on the page. The paper was covered in several of the scientific diagrams that Wenderoth had drawn, and after a few moments I realized that it seemed to be about the angles and phases of the moon. This is about the moon, right? I asked. I guess that's not a surprise, since the vampires consider the goddess to be their enemy. Imelda, Sybil whispered, and the dark-haired witch looked up at the ex-vampire. Maybe you should explain it. Of course, Imelda said and took a deep breath as she picked up several sheets of printer paper that she'd written on. These are diagrams of the moon, and the placement of its axis, as you guessed. It said that the power to shift is determined by the specific axis of the moon. Even though the power has been passed down through families, this diagram is basically saying that there was one original angle which started the foundations of Lupercalian culture. I looked at the illustration, which showed the moon in various states of being tilted. Even though I knew Wenderoth had created the notebook, I had to at least admire his craftsmanship when it came to drawing. The illustrations were so detailed, and it struck me as odd that an evil creature in another world could have been so meticulous. The moon looked exactly like it did in our world. So it's like a kind of Genesis story, I said. This was how the shifters were created. I've heard similar theories in the Lupercalian castle, Tabitha added. So it checks out. It's not just complete, speculation. You can call it horseshit, I said with a smile. Horseshit then, Tabitha declared. It's also backed up by religious doctrine, Imelda added. The moon goddess is an active participant in Lupercalian society, so we usually turn to her word rather than scientific theories. But the two match? I asked. There isn't much difference. It's not about difference, Imelda explained. It's just comparable. Most of the origins of our culture are kept through visual depictions, archival accounts, and oral history. It's not like there's a written text that outlines how the moon goddess wants us to live. It's a very social society. The religious attitude was vastly different to anything I'd heard in my childhood. My parents weren't super devout Christians, but we went to church on the important holidays like Easter and Christmas, and my parents always emphasized that we should lead a good Christian life, though that wasn't always so easy to define. The idea that there was an actual present goddess who communicated with her people would have been completely wild to me before my first trip to Lupercalia. After all, the god I'd grown up with required belief in place of face-to-face communication. I thought about all the religious texts and interpretations, that people fought over because all they had to go on were a few texts, and it made sense that the followers of the moon goddess were such a cohesive group of people since they could talk to her. You seem lost, Hank, Tabitha said as she prodded me. Oh, I murmured and shook my head. Yeah. Sorry, I just got lost in thought. Well, this is the beginning, Imelda said as she gestured to the diagrams. Wenderoth had to get to the beginning of the blue blood lifeline so that he could get to the end, Sybil sighed, and she flipped the page. This page was full of more diagrams of blue bloods. There were more illustrations that had been hidden under the original writing, and it showed the results of the dissection of both a werewolf and a vampire. I looked at the two images side by side and shuddered at the gruesome depictions of their insides. Being a vampire changes your entire physical composition, Imelda murmured, and her bright blue eyes glowed as she swept some hair out of her face. That's why it's impossible to change back well without divine intervention. Anyway, and as the only known vampire to change back, I'd say she was an authority on that, Tabitha said. So that's what this was for? I asked. Wenderoth had decorated the diagram of a vampire with several arrows that pointed to various body parts of interest. It reminded me of something I'd seen in one of my high school science courses, and after a moment I realized it was similar to the drawings of how blood circulated through the human body. And if that was what Wenderoth had drawn, then it looked like blood traveled differently around a vampire body than it did around a human or werewolf body. In a vampire, it was pushed straight from the neck into different nerves and veins, and the general motion was down instead of around, with almost none going to the brain. Whoa, I heard myself say. This explains why so many vampires lose their mental functions. There's no blood going to the brain. And that's why vampires need to feed, the priestess said. Without a heart to force the blood to the different organs, there's no way to clean the blood or create new blood. The only way to replace it is to drink the blood of others. And it explains why they're hungry all the time, Sybil said. This isn't a very efficient system. It takes so long for the blood to circulate that some part of the body is always demanding more blood. And do the Lupercalian nobles know this? I asked. I feel like if the Lupercalian blue bloods know this, we could use this to defeat the vampires once and for all. It wasn't previously known, Tabitha said. So that's the first revelation we had today. The girls exchanged a look before turning to me. And might I ask what the second was? I prompted when no one spoke. Look, Tabitha said and pointed to the diagram of the werewolf. Blue blood circulates around the body in the same way that human blood does, Sybil said, but at a far faster rate. It's thought that blue blood exhibits different properties to red blood, and that's why men who possess it have the ability to shift. Of course, you're the exception to that rule, Tabitha added, which is why you were such an enigma to the court. But I was blessed with my powers by the moon goddess, I said. And who can explain a thing like that? There is no other explanation, Tabitha said with a nod. She reigns supreme over all of this. Okay, I said. So, this is all very interesting and potentially useful, but what's the dark knowledge you mentioned? This doesn't seem particularly evil. I've got similar diagrams in my old high school biology book. The dark knowledge is that this isn't just a journal, Tabitha said and flipped back to the first page. Melchior didn't pick up on it, but Imelda could, because she'd spent so much time with the vampires. It's true, Imelda said. At the beginning of the notebook there's a forward. In Melchior's notes he'd put it as a kind of location finder so the vampires could find it again if it was lost. But this translation doesn't take into account the nuance of the vampire language. It is a message, but it's not just in case it gets lost. Then what is it? I asked. It's a common greeting, Imelda said. Not the kind of thing you would know about if you weren't a vampire. Okay, I said. So this was intended for one person, Imelda said with a nod. It was intended for one vampire to read. Wenderoth might have spearheaded the research and the mission, but he was doing it for someone else. I felt a chill race up my spine, and my hair stood on end. If Wenderoth wasn't the chief of the whole operation, then this meant that we had some much bigger fish to fry. Shit, I said. Well, did he address it to someone in particular? He just refers to him as the master, Sybil said. This is someone I've never heard of, for the record, Imelda said. I always assumed that Windroth was in charge. None of the other vampires ever referred to a master or someone like that. But the way that this is written is beginning to make me think that Windroth is just the public face of the vampires in Lupercalia, and there's someone even more powerful who's really in charge. So there's someone or something else out there who is what? I mused. It's not like the vampires have been all that organized. That's what we were taught, Tabitha said. But as we saw when we fought Windroth, that's not true. And then there's this book, Imelda said. Yeah, I sighed. So what you're telling me is that the vampires were a lot more clever than we thought, and there's some vampire leader somewhere that I assume is plotting the downfall of the Blue Bloods. Yes, Sybil replied with a nod. And that's not even the worst part. How is that not the worst part? I asked. We thought the same thing, Tabitha sighed, and the noblewoman shook her head. It seems so ludicrous, but it's true. Okay, I said. Lay it on me. Just how much worse does it get? The experiments themselves are unthinkable, Tabitha said as she pointed to one of the pages. Completely unthinkable. Windroth had been postulating I can't even say it. It's too terrible. He wanted to turn werewolves into vampires, Imelda blurted out. So it turned out the girls were right. This really was the worst possible eventuality that could have come out of the notebook. This turned everything I knew about Lupercalia on its head. In their society, this was the equivalent of someone trying to mess with the laws of gravity or something. It goes against everything that is right in the world, Tabitha said. That's awful, I murmured as I shook my head. That's just truly awful. I know, Sybil nodded. The magic he was using has to do with a combination of naturally occurring rocks and how they can affect the laws of gravity and push the blood down in a way that's similar to how vampires process biological matter in their body. Okay, so this actually did mess with the laws of gravity. The zombie wolf was only the first step, Tabitha sighed. He got the necromancy down. Now he's trying to make them sustain some kind of eternal life as a vampire. So this means that they're trying to harness the werewolf powers against the blue bloods, I said. These vampire werewolves would become part of a vampire clan, would act like a vampire, but they'd still be able to shift into their wolf forms. My God, they'd be unstoppable. Exactly, Sybil said. It would be the most powerful beast in Lupercalia. Furthermore, it would represent a kind of crusade against the goddess. She banished the vampires and gave the kingdom to her followers long ago. But if her followers take on the form of vampires, then everything will fall back into darkness. So all hell would break loose in the kingdom, I said. Hell? Imelda said as she raised an eyebrow. Yeah, I said. Trust me, it's really bad. It's a shock to me too, Tabitha said with a sigh, because I grew up in the palace and I never knew that something this terrible possibly existed. We were always told that the vampires were too stupid to defeat us, that they were just some pests that we could outmuscle. But they've been working hard, Sybil said. Or at least Windroth was working hard. He had the blood supply to keep his mind sharp, Imelda said. And he had the luxury of a coven to hunt for him and do his bidding while he worked on his scientific experiments. A truly privileged vampire, I noted. This information had really thrown a curveball in everything I thought about the palace and Lupercalia. I'd suspected there was something more to the vampires ever since my first encounter with Windroth, but as the new guy in town, no one was willing to believe me over centuries of tradition that said the vampires were mindless creatures that could be dealt with by the occasional questing knight. Well, I'd saved their asses a few times already, and it looked like I was going to have to do it again. I think I need another nap after all that, Tabitha said, and she started to stand up. No, I said, and the aristocrat folded her arms and shot me a look. No, she asked. Nope, I said, and I got to my feet as well. Look, girls, we have to go back to the palace. We need to tell the king about this immediately before this master can figure out how to turn a werewolf into a vampire. But what about the notebook? Imelda asked, and her bright blue eyes widened. Sybil and Tabitha said that last time you had the notebook in Lupercalia, someone tried to break into your house and steal it from you. It's true, I said with a shrug. But we need proof. And Imelda, you're the only one who can speak the vampire language, so you'll need to explain what it says. I'd be afraid to speak it in front of the king, she murmured. It would be An offense to use such harsh language in his presence. You're a priestess, Imelda, Sybil said. And you were given your human form. Again by the goddess for just this purpose. The king won't be offended if you read a few passages. He'd be more offended if you refused to speak, Tabitha added. Okay, Imelda sighed. So what do we do now? Now we change into some Lupercalian clothing and then get the hell out of here, I said as I stood up. At least we're going to the palace, Tabitha said. I'm sure I could find a comfortable bed there. I'm sure you will, I said with a grin and then pointed to the notebook. I'll take that. I'll keep it on me the whole time we're in Lupercalia so no one can steal it. Sybil nodded as she handed me the pungent book, and then the three girls returned to their closet to find something more appropriate to wear to the palace. While they picked through their seemingly endless pieces of clothing, I headed back to my room to find something less New Jersey to wear. I threw on some black suede pants and a gray suede tunic. The material was warm but incredibly soft against my skin, and I pulled on my boots before stepping out into the hallway to find my girls. Sybil was wearing her classic long green dress, and Imelda was wearing a long navy blue dress with silver vertical stripes. To my great shock, Tabitha was also wearing a long suede black dress with a square neck and black leather boots. You all look amazing, I said. Do we have everything we need? Oh, just a sec, Sybil said. I heard her run back to the office and a few moments later she reappeared with her signature basket on her arm. I guess I won't be getting a hamburger on this trip, Tabitha sighed. But Hank's right. We need to save the kingdom. I nodded as I shoved the notebook inside my pants and tucked it into a low pocket that reached all the way to my knees. I didn't know what the pocket was for in the first place, but it seemed like the perfect location to store a contraband notebook. Ready? I asked. We are, Imelda said as we all linked arms. You can stay here, Tabitha, I said. No one would think any less of you. You do need to protect the baby, Sybil said. And I will, the noblewoman replied. But you should all know me well enough by now to know that I'm not going to miss out on this. And if I puke, I puke. I nodded and then twisted the ring on my pinky. The floor disappeared from beneath my feet, and the ceiling flew away as we soared and floated through time and space. For a few quiet seconds I was 10 million miles away from all of the corporate drama of Barney Converse and all of the crazy plans of the vampires. And then the ground appeared under my feet again, and I could feel gravity pulling me down. My bedroom in Lupercalia appeared around me, and the world was suddenly solid again. Fuck, Tabitha muttered as she and Sybil ran out of my bedroom to one of the closest toilet chambers. Crap, Imelda sighed. I doubt she'll make it to the outhouse. One of the servants is going to have to clean the bedpan up. I know, I sighed. It's good that we are alerting the palace, Imelda said as she placed her soft hand on my arm. It's important that they know about threats such as these. Even if the plan has not yet come to fruition, the king and his advisors will find a way to protect the blue bloods and the rest of Lupercalia. Exactly, I said. The two girls reappeared a moment later, and Sybil patted Tabitha on the back as the blonde aristocrat fixed her hair back into place and smoothed out her slightly green complexion. It's fine, the noblewoman said. It's just not natural to travel between worlds like that. You're right, I laughed. But right now, it's the only way we have. You'll want to put some chain mail on if we're going to the palace, Tabitha noted. I know, I said as I made my way to the mannequin that held my cleaned and repaired armor. I'll admit, sometimes it's easier to be in New Jersey where I don't have to walk around in armor all the time. But you'd get bored there after a while, Sybil said. Probably, I admitted. The servants had already seen to the repairs and polished the armor after my last quest, and it sparkled like it had never been worn. The chainmail slithered over my body like a snake, and the weight was comfortable on my shoulders. I'll go get Casanova, Sybil said. The witch gave me a quick kiss and then headed for the door with the other two girls behind her. There was some giggling from the group and then I heard their footsteps in the hall and on the stairs. I checked the mirror to make sure I looked acceptable enough for the king. Smoothed down my dark, now unruly hair and straightened out my clothing. Looked pretty damn handsome, that was for sure, and I shot myself a grin before I followed after the girls. The door to the house was wide open, and the afternoon sun spilled into the foyer. The girls were gathered on the bottom step as they waited for Jacob to appear with Casanova, but even from the doorway it was obvious they were tense. I just hope we're in time, Imelda said. What if they've already managed to change someone? Or maybe they already knew about the plan, Sybil said. And they decided not to tell anyone because they thought it would cause a panic. Don't be ridiculous, Tabitha snapped. But I could tell that Sybil had hit a nerve. The palace prided itself on its information gathering, but if they didn't already know about the vampires' plot, then the king's spy system had serious issues. And if that were true, how many other potential threats had gone undiscovered? Jacob appeared at that moment with Casanova fully bedecked in his reins and a flag with my heraldry on the side. The big black dog's green eyes sparkled when he saw all of us, and he let his tongue flop out of his mouth. Suddenly, a little pink face appeared from behind one of his large ears, and Prometheus oinked at us and flashed his little hooves. Even though things were pretty intense right now, I felt a smile stretch across my face when I saw the little pig. Ah, Imelda cooed. The little one has made fast friends with Casanova, Jacob laughed as he handed me the reins. He really does think he's a direwolf. They even race sometimes, and Casanova walks very slowly so that the piglet can win. That's literally the cutest thing I've ever heard in my life, Sybil said as she brought her hands to her mouth. See, Tabitha? Pigs can be adorable too. Adorable and delicious, Tabitha said as she raised an eyebrow. Come on, ladies, I said before Sybil could reply. I swung my leg over Casanova's black, silky fur and took the reins, and then I watched the ladies climb up with me. I noticed that Tabitha once again claimed the spot right behind me, and she buried her face into my shoulder. I like the way you smell, she murmured into my ear. It's comforting. I'm glad you like it, I replied. I'll have to make sure I buy more of that particular soap. It's not the soap I'm smelling, she whispered. With all of us piled on top of Casanova, it felt like we were riding the world's biggest, furriest motorcycle. But poor Sybil, who was at the back, didn't have much room to spare, so I had no idea how we'd all fit on top once my kid was born. Prometheus turned around and oinked at me just then, and I stared at the piglet in surprise. I knew rodeos often use sheep for the really young riders, so maybe I could teach my child how to ride a direwolf by plopping them on a pig. If the pigs at the farm were any indication, the piglet would certainly be big enough. Hank? Tabitha asked. Right, I said and shook away my thoughts about pig riding. One of the peasants flung the main gate open as Casanova started to trot along the path. The path out of the manor felt like a kind of runway, especially with the speed that Casanova was able to gain on the way out. I quickly grabbed Prometheus from behind his ears and passed him back to Sybil before we got up to speed, and then I nudged the direwolf just as we passed through the gate. Casanova raced through the beautiful, rolling Lupercalian greenery, but he was so fast it was all a blur. He sped over hill and dale until both the village of Stock and the palace were in sight. The pup started to head toward Stock, so I tugged on the rein until we were heading to the palace. I felt like I hadn't been back to the castle in forever, and the imposing gray building stuck out against the calm blue of the late afternoon sky. I could see the outline of a few squires lighting torches as well as the 2 guards, who were always on duty. I pulled back on the reins, and Casanova slowed down as we approached the drawbridge. I got a whiff of the water in the moat, and I felt like my senses were affronted. Usually I was in and out of the castle so much that I didn't even notice the strange smell, but today it seemed more pungent than usual. Smells like fresh potion here, Sybil said. They must be protecting the moat. Usually they do it at the change of seasons. As I said, it's an important alchemical time in the Lupercalian calendar. I know, I sighed. It smells terrible. Just like you, Sybil, Tabitha giggled, and I heard Prometheus even oink in agreement. Oh haha, Sybil groaned. A few squires in red and yellow striped tunics and golden velvet floppy hats with blue tassels got wind of our arrival and started to run toward us. A familiar face led the charge, and Casanova yipped happily when he spotted Sebastian. Sir Henry Baker, the squire said, and he bowed even lower than his normal height. What a great honor it is to have your presence in the castle once more. Thanks, Sebastian, I laughed. We actually need to see the king quite urgently. Well, I'm sure he's around somewhere, Sebastian said with a nervous laugh. Here, let me take Casanova. And Prometheus, Sybil said as she slid off the direwolf. The witch pulled the little piglet from her basket, and he offered us a goofy smile as she placed him behind Casanova's right ear. Oh, Prometheus, Sebastian said, and he patted the piglet on the head. It's always fun to make more animal friends. I love animal friends, Tabitha announced as she dismounted the direwolf. They're delicious. Sybil and Imelda didn't even respond this time, because Tabitha was obviously having so much fun with the bit. Yes, Sebastian laughed nervously, and he shot a nervous look at us before I waved my hand to signal that it was all okay. Thanks so much, Sebastian, I said, and I smiled at the little squire before making my way to the main entrance. We clattered up the stone staircase to the rosette window, where Tabitha suddenly sprinted ahead despite her pregnancy. I wasn't sure if it was the promise of food that spurred her on or the fact that we were back in the palace, but she was clearly happy to be back. The noblewoman did wait until we caught up with her at the door before she knocked, though she was clearly impatient. She tapped her foot and scowled at me, and as soon as I was by her side, she pounded on the wood. The door opened a crack, and Dromgoole stared up at us. He was dressed in the same outfit as the other squires, but he'd added a pair of round glasses with lenses so thick that his eyes looked like they were 2 sizes too big for his head. Dromgoole, I said. Sir Henry, he shouted as he jumped back. My goodness, you are looking incredibly handsome today. Isn't he? Tabitha asked, and the blonde aristocrat winked at me. Thanks, I said. My apologies if that was very forthright, Sir Henry, he muttered quickly as he pulled the door back. You see, I recently had my eyes tested. As it turns out, I've been half blind for most of my life. I thought that the world was a dull, blurry place before all this, but it turns out that it's quite beautiful and sharp and full of gorgeous people. That's great, Dromgoole, I said as we stepped into the dining hall, but I'm sure that I didn't sound terribly convincing. I'm really happy for you. My eyes darted to the throne, where I expected the king to be, but when I saw that the imposing wooden chair was empty, my stomach sank. This Windroth business was urgent, and we couldn't afford to wait any longer to tell him the news. Luckily, the dining hall wasn't too full, so I sauntered in and tried to ignore the whispers of the other nobles. I hadn't shown my face in court in a while, and I knew everyone was hoping I would stop at their table for a little chit-chat. Sir Henry, I heard a familiar gruff voice call out, and I knew that I couldn't ignore this one. It was Greyback. I looked over to my left, and Greyback was heading for me with a big smile on his face. He was in his hybrid form, which reminded me that I should probably follow suit if I wanted to talk to the king, so I shook my head and I could feel myself grow to my 9-foot form. Greyback, I said and gripped his arm. Is the king here? We really must speak to him. But of course you must, he roared as he picked me up off the ground and swung me around. The most precocious knight in Lupercalia, to be married to the finest witch in the land and a member of the Blue Claw family. The king has been waiting for your visit. I had no idea that word had gotten out this quickly about our upcoming nuptials, but clearly the news had already spread. I knew Greyback and Blue Claw were friends, so maybe the 2 old knights had whispered about it over their tea while I was in New Jersey. We're still working on the details, I said when Greyback finally set me on the ground again. But we're excited. Hear, hear. A knight I didn't recognize called out as the dining hall started to fill with the sound of rumbling feet. Thanks, I said and waved to the knights. I know that you haven't officially announced the wedding, Greyback said as he leaned in. But you know how far back old Blue Claw and I go. He couldn't keep it from me, boy. I could see it on his face. He was grinning from ear to ear. Of course he couldn't keep his mouth shut, Tabitha sighed. He's really just made of mush on the inside. Only when it comes to the women in his life, Greyback replied. Truly, I said. But we really do need to see the king. We have something important to discuss. There's nothing more important than a wedding, Greyback said with a wistful look in his eye. It's one of the most beautiful times in one's life. Yes, we fight beasts, kill foes, and protect the land, but there's just something about finding the women who you want to spend the rest of your... Greyback's speech was cut off by the sound of trumpets, and the rest of the knights sprang to attention. At least we won't have to track him down, Sybil whispered. I'll stand for His Royal Highness, the King of Lupercalia. a squire shouted. The king emerged from behind the large tapestry that depicted the moon goddess, defending her subjects, and acknowledged his subjects with a quick wave of his hand. He looked preoccupied, and he barely seemed to notice when the conversations around him resumed. Looks like he's already had some bad news, Tabitha whispered. And he's about to get more, I said. Chapter 15. Just a moment, Greyback, I muttered to the old knight. We need to talk to the king. The old knight didn't look surprised, and he stepped out of the way as the girls and I charged across the dining hall toward the dais where the king sat. Sire, Tabitha said, and the blonde noblewoman somehow made a low curtsy, right in front of the king without falling over despite our abrupt stop. Miss Blueclaw, he said, and a wolfish grin spread across his face. Why, I hear that there is currently some very fortuitous news in the house of Baker. Now, I haven't yet received an invitation, which I'm sure you'll remedy right away. But word travels fast among the court, as you well know. Even words that should be secret, of course. In fact, maybe especially words that should be secret. Oh well, there's so much to plan, Tabitha replied. We haven't even designed the invitations yet. Your Highness, Sybil cut in and made a curtsy of her own. Ah, the other wife, the king declared. Yes, Sybil stammered. But if we could just talk to you for a moment. Of course, he laughed. And what do you wish to discuss? If you want to hold the ceremony here. Sir, I said sharply, I just need a moment of your time. A moment, for the most impressive new shifter in the court? The king laughed. Why, I could spare far more than a moment. Sir Henry, how many days have passed since your proposals? My mouth hung open for a moment as I tried to decide what to say. As a knight, I couldn't defy my king and not answer his question, but I really needed to tell him about the vampire's plans. Well, it wasn't that long ago, Tabitha murmured and looked up at me. Right? Hank. I said, and I tried to count the days between Sybil and Tabitha's proposals. I think it was maybe. If it wasn't yesterday, it's too long for Lupercalia, the king declared. I don't know how they do it in the strange land where you're from, Sir Henry, but marriage is nothing to be waited on here. Everyone, the king wishes to make a royal decree. I held my breath as the king stood up, and one errant squire blasted an awkward note on his trumpet. The other trumpet squires glared at him for trying to steal the moment and failing. Normally it was something I would have laughed at, but this time all I could think about was the fact that the king needed to hurry up so we could get down to business. A royal decree? Sybil hissed, and she shot me a look with her piercing green eyes. What does he mean by that? We don't have time for this now. Just go with it, Tabitha whispered. It will only take a few minutes and then we can talk to him alone. The crowd had gone quiet, so the gathered nobles could probably hear the two women whispering to each other even if they couldn't hear their exact words. Few knights glanced at the pair, but Tabitha flashed Sybil a warning look and the witch fell quiet. Loyal members of the court, the king boomed when the place was finally still. I would like to bring all of your attention to the knight in front of me, Sir Henry Baker of New Jersey. There were a few murmurs between members of the court, and I saw a few shrugs. Is he going to? Tabitha started to ask. I decree that the nuptials of Sir Henry Baker and his brides will take place in the palace courtyard tomorrow evening, at the first mark of sunset. I froze in place, and the girls tried their damnedest to put on a smile as the entire court erupted into cheers and rumbles. I smiled and waved at the groups of nobles, but my mind was still reeling from the fact that my marriage was to take place the next day, and I still hadn't passed along the information we'd uncovered. How the hell had this happened? The king sat back down on his throne and gave me a satisfied grin and an eyebrow wiggle. I love a wedding, Sir Henry, the king chuckled. It's the perfect occasion to wear some of my finest garb. And it's an honor to be wed here, I said as I took a step closer. But before we discuss any wedding plans, there's something far more important we need to discuss. The king's smile vanished as he studied us, and he even glanced over my head toward Greyback like the knight would have some inkling of why we were bothering him when he just declared that our wedding was a done deal. What is it, boy? The king asked. Once a proposal is made, marriage is quite imminent. It's simply the Lupercalian way. Didn't Tabitha tell you that? Tabitha turned bright beetroot pink because once again we realized that She'd failed to leave an essential detail of court life out. The king looked at the noblewoman in surprise, shook his head, and looked back at me. It's not about the wedding, I whispered as I leaned in closer. It's about the safety of the kingdom. Ah, he sighed. I suspected as much, though I think I would have preferred it if you had an issue with the wedding arrangements. So what is this danger you've come to warn me about? It's about Wenderoth, I replied. We've uncovered another plot in the notebook, and we had to tell you immediately. The king's eyes widened, and he lifted a hand and summoned over one of the squires as he nodded at us. Yes, yes, he said before turning to face the squire. Spatchcock, I will be escorting these 4 into the royal offices immediately. I request no fanfare at this time. Yes, sire, the eager squire nodded, and he ran to the others to tell them. I knew that the squires had a complex communication system around the castle, and I'd finally figured out that among other things the long chain of squires and their horns kept the palace informed of the king's whereabouts and activities. The fact that the king didn't want his next move trumpeted all over the court meant that he understood just how dire the situation was. Come with me, the king said as he removed his cape and stood up. I watched as one absent-minded squire started to lift his long trumpet to his lips before another one got wind of what was happening. The second squire knocked the trumpet clean out of his hands with his own trumpet. He said, no fanfare, you stupid elf. I heard another one of the squires hiss to the absent-minded one. The only reason I'm here is because I like to play the trumpet, the absent-minded squire sighed. It was pretty well known around the castle that the king didn't have great hearing even when he was in hybrid form, so I knew that he wouldn't hear the squires squabbling. But I found it funny that the other knights in blue bloods had super wolf hearing abilities, and could easily listen in on all the logistical mishaps at hand. The king led us through the door behind the tapestry without the usual fanfare, though everyone who had overheard the squires knew the king was leaving. There was a narrow hallway and a set of stairs behind the tapestry, which I'd had the privilege of using before, and I thought the king would head for the steps. However, he knocked 3 times on the wall to the right, which swung open to reveal another hallway. Whoa! Tabitha blurted out from behind me. I've never seen this before. Yes, you have, the king laughed as he led us inside. But from a different direction. And you're probably far too old now to remember when all the children were escorted to the landscape room for a lesson on Lupercalian geography. With that, the king opened a door and led us into a room with thick burgundy carpet and paintings of the Lupercalian countryside on every square inch of wall space. Our muffled footsteps were the only sound in the place, which reminded me of a library even though there were no books. Ah, geography, Tabitha sighed. It's still my favorite topic, Your Highness. Which is why she's the best navigator in all of Lupercalia, Sybil said. Ah, thanks, Sybil, Tabitha said as she nudged her friend. The king led us into another hallway that was quiet and dusty, like it wasn't used very often. The king was humming a tune that I didn't know, and he looked completely unconcerned about the fact that we seemed to be lost. You say that this is about Wenderoth? The king asked when he came to an abrupt stop in the middle of the hallway. Yes, I answered. It's about his notebook. There's all these diagrams. Scientific and, alchemical, Sybil supplied. Alchemical? The king snapped. Squire. A tiny door that I hadn't even noticed swung open, and a small man stepped out. Your Highness, he said as he bowed. You have requested my presence. I am escorting this knight and these ladies to my personal office, he said, as he lifted an eyebrow. Make sure that we are met by the wizard and the doctor. Wizard and doctor, of course, the squire muttered before he ran back into the tiny door and disappeared. Whoa, Sybil muttered under her breath. We were all impressed by the squire system anyway, but I hadn't realized just how far it stretched. It seemed like they really were the eyes and ears of the castle, and that they knew absolutely everything there was to know. No wonder they were such intense gossips. The king had started forward again as soon as the squire vanished, and we had to hurry to catch up to him. He stopped in front of an arched doorway, threw the door open, and marched inside like the king that he was. The girls and I looked at each other, and then we stepped through the door one at a time. At first glance, I noticed there was another door on the other side of the room, and when I looked back at the one we just come through, I realized it was disguised as a bookcase. Shut the door, please, the king ordered. I pushed gently on the bookcase once Imelda was inside the room, and the door swung shut without so much as a squeak. I shook my head in amazement and then turned to study the rest of the room. It wasn't the most resplendent room I'd ever seen in the castle, but this one felt like the place where the real business of the kingdom was conducted. It was shaped like an octagon, and most of the polished wood floor was covered in a dark blue carpet with a gray vine pattern. The walls of the office were painted a matching blue, and silver vines traced a delicate pattern toward the ceiling, though most of the paintwork was hidden by the bookshelves. Hundreds of leather-bound books packed the shelves, while others were stacked on the floor. A delicate candelabra provided the only light for the room, yet it was somehow enough to read by or to admire the small objects that were hidden among the chaos. "Sir Henry and Company," the king said as he sat down in a velvet-covered chair. "Tell me your tale. You said this has to do with that notebook you found when you killed Wenderoth." "It does," I replied. "The cipher was able to translate several sections. Before he was killed, Sybil and Imelda have taken up that task, and they've recently found something disturbing." "Anything involving vampires is disturbing," the king said, and then looked at Imelda. "I meant no offense, priestess." "None taken," the one-time vampire replied. "I wholeheartedly agree with you." There was a knock at the other door, and we all glanced at it. "Come in," the king bellowed. The door opened to reveal two men, one of whom I recognized from my very first day in Lupercalia. It was the doctor, and he wore the same round-rimmed glasses and gray tunic with black boots that he'd had on during my initial examination. His gray hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat, and his face was red like he'd run all the way here. "Sire," the doctor said, "Rorschach and I are here as requested." The doctor stepped into a room and made way for Rorschach, who I assumed to be the wizard. I was surprised to find that he was dressed exactly how I expected a wizard to look, with a long purple velvet cloak that had been embroidered with gold stars. He wore a velvet triangle hat on his head, and his gray beard went down to his knees. "Greetings, Your Highness," the wizard said as he swept a long strand of oily gray hair out of his face. "I came as quickly as I could." "That is most appreciated, Rorschach," the king sighed. "Now if you will explain what the problem is." "My goodness," the doctor said, and he adjusted his glasses on his eyes. "It's the red-blooded shifter." "That's me," I said with a laugh. "The anomaly himself," the doctor sighed. "Is this about?" The doctor trailed off and looked at us like he expected someone to announce that I had contracted some terrible disease. "About Hank," Tabitha finished as she lifted an eyebrow at the doctor. "No, it isn't. In fact, there's even more trouble in store for the kingdom than a red-blooded shifter." "Well, I never," the doctor said as he shook his head. "It seems like you've introduced me to yet more magic than I've never known before, Sir Henry Baker." I reached into my long pants pocket and rifled around for the notebook as Imelda gave both the wizard and the doctor a quick backstory about what was going on. "So you see, that's why I was able to translate it," I heard her say. "I'm familiar with the vampire language, not by my own doing, of course." "Of course not, my child," the king laughed, and he placed a big hairy paw on the blonde priestess' head. "And as evil as that curse was, it seems it has now made you indispensable to our team." I smiled when I sensed the palpable relief that came over Imelda, and when her pale skin started to glow again, I knew that she was less ashamed of her past. "Here's the notebook," I said, and for a second both the doctor and the wizard looked hesitant to touch it. "It's not cursed, is it?" the doctor asked as he looked up at the wizard, who rolled his eyes. "Of course it's not cursed," the wizard said, "but I can tell that there was a spell put on this so that we may know the location. Isn't that so, Sir Henry?" "Yes," Sybil said for me. "The cipher confirmed that." "But how did you know?" "I'm the royal wizard," Rorschach replied as he took the notebook in his hands. "I can smell a spell from a mile away." He started to finger through the notebook, and every so often he would stop and show a particular page to both the king and the doctor. The wizard seemed intrigued by what he saw, while the king remained aloof. Only the doctor seemed to be scared of what he saw. No, the doctor murmured as he looked at the floor. "These are large ideas that I can understand, but I'm afraid it's not my area of expertise." What do you mean by that? The king asked with a raised eyebrow. Are you suggesting that you're not the best medical practitioner in the kingdom? That's not the science that's contained in the notebook, Your Highness, if I might be so bold, the doctor said quickly as he swallowed. That's. It's magic, the wizard sighed. Very high magic. Very powerful magic. From a vampire? The king scoffed. Proposing to do what? Change the direction of the blood in the body? Those creatures are obsessed with blood. Filthy addicts, they disgust me. Excuse me, Imelda. No offense taken, sire, Imelda said quickly and shot a look at me. But I can assure you that this is no small feat that Wenderoth is describing. In fact, it's unthinkable magic that puts all of Lupercalia in danger. Theoretically, Rorschach said quickly. Imelda, I don't speak the language of the vampires, but was there any kind of report on whether they've attempted this? Any proof? It's one thing to postulate ideas as a thought experiment, as I'm sure you know, Sybil, but another thing entirely to actually attempt the experiment itself. Oh yes, the witch said, and she crumpled her nose in confusion. But how did you know that? Rorschach seems to know a lot, Tabitha said skeptically. Might as well just leave him to his work. Also, Sybil, you look as witchy as they come. There wasn't any evidence of testing these ideas, at least not in the notebook, Imelda said. But there's so much detail in there that I believe he'd already done some research. It's unthinkable, the king said as he leaned back in his velvet chair and shook his head. Just unthinkable. That's what I thought too, Tabitha insisted, and she stepped toward the doubtful monarch. But we can't simply ignore it because we don't believe that vampires are smart enough to do this. Innocent questing knights are going to their deaths every day, and that's how it's always been, hasn't it? The king asked with a cocked eyebrow. That's the way of the royals. Not all knights make it, and Hank is a shining example of someone who made it every single time. But he was right about the undead knight, I said, and I saw the doctor and the wizard look up at me before exchanging a glance. Your Highness, I know it's unthinkable, but we've already seen what Wenderoth was capable of doing. And if Wenderoth was right about that, then he's probably right about this. This master of the vampires could be continuing Wenderoth's work even as we speak. I ignored the warning look Tabitha shot me and focused on the man behind the desk. I didn't want to defy the king, but I had to make him understand the danger that Lupercalia was in. If Wenderoth was as close to completing his mission as it appeared in the notebook, then the kingdom was in dire trouble. So what you're saying is, the king murmured, what we're looking at is, don't even want to say it. There's a chance werewolves could be turned into vampires. Yes, Rorschach sighed as he ran his finger along one of the pages. Yes, it looks like Imelda's interpretation is correct. Sir Henry is right to be worried. What are we going to do? The doctor whispered, and he looked between the girls and I. If this has gone as far as you've suggested, we could be facing an imminent attack. He's right, Imelda murmured, and suddenly her face turned a sickly green color. Don't get everyone all riled up, the wizard said as he started to play with his long gray beard. I recognize some of the runes that are being used in the spell, you know. Really? Sybil asked. But those are some of the most ancient runes I've ever seen. I've never seen anything quite like them. Well, I'm also probably far more ancient than anything you've ever seen, the wizard replied with a wink. But this type of ancient magic didn't develop in Lupercalia. It developed on the outskirts outside of Gomel, far into the hills. And I know a few wizards who practice there because the space between kingdoms is a powerful alchemical territory. So they might have the answers? Tabitha asked. They might be able to tell us how close the vampires are to succeeding. Well, yes, the wizard said with a nod. But I'll have to find them. I'll have to journey there myself because they won't talk to non-wizards about this. On the plus side, the trip will also give me a chance to see if there are any other clues. But why can't we go? Sybil asked. We're used to long, dangerous journeys. Well, if you spend enough time with the famed Sir Henry Baker, I'm sure you are, the wizard said with a kind smile. But as I said, they prefer to talk to other wizards. And I am the foremost expert in runes in the entire kingdom. You're not going to be able to collect information as accurately and quickly as I will. But the cipher, I blurted out, and I waved my hand in the air as I tried to Explain what had happened. The cipher was killed because he possessed the notebook. He was murdered by followers of Wendroth, and there's bound to be more vampires in the outskirts of Lupercalia than there are here. They can probably sense the notebook, and they'll come looking for it. My child, please, the wizard sighed. But the king held his paw up when he saw me open my mouth again, and we all stood still for his ruling. Sir Henry's concerns are legitimate, the king said. And Rorschach, I know that you are protected with the most sophisticated magic in the kingdom, but I think it would be worth taking a little young blood along for protection. Don't you think? For a second my ears perked up. I didn't know what the king was implying, but of course I would be willing to accompany the wizard to the utmost ends of Lupercalia. So will we go? Sybil asked, and she bobbed from foot to foot as the king shook his head. No, you're getting married tomorrow, the king said. By the goddess, it was a royal decree. I can't go back on a royal decree. That's the nature of them. What would happen if you did? Tabitha asked. Just theoretically. I don't know, the king admitted with a shrug. But it's never been done before, so I doubt it'd be good. Anyway, Rorschach, you're being sent with 2 trusted moon knights. I will have made my selections before the end of the day, and let you know. You will be protected on your journey to the Lupercalian border with their manpower and your magic, and I'm sure that will be enough. But, I said, and I noticed that the wizard lifted his hand from his sleeve to reveal a moon silver ring on his left hand. Holy shit. He also had one. The wizard lifted an eyebrow and nodded once at me, and I only nodded in return. For a moment it felt like we were the only 2 people in the room, and I got the message that maybe he had the power to teleport within Lupercalia, or maybe even other worlds completely. You trust that I will be protected? The wizard asked as he looked at me. Of course you will, the king replied before I could speak. Now go and prepare for your journey. But what about the notebook? Sybil asked. You said yourself that there's some kind of spell on it. I can disable such spells with ease, the wizard said with a nod. And I can assure you that though I may be ancient, older even than the king, my age is a benefit. It comes with a wisdom that the strength and brawn of youth could never come close to achieving. Speak for yourself, the doctor muttered to himself with a smile. I remember in the old days why I used to ride my horse to the edge of the... Why is everyone still here? The king asked. You, wizard, have a journey to prepare for. And you, Sir Henry, have a wedding to deal with. I'm sorry I'll miss that, Rorschach said. Though I must admit that I've seen many weddings. Don't you dare say they're all the same, Tabitha cut in with a wink. Because the wedding of a blue claw and a red-blooded shifter is nothing to be scoffed at. And me, Sybil, the witch added proudly, and the others all exchanged an awkward look. Yes, of course, the wizard laughed. I was going to say that they are all equally delightful and special in their own way. But my duty calls me to protect the kingdom of Lupercalia, and Hank, I'm sure that this is a sentiment you understand. It absolutely is, I said with a nod. Thank you for helping us. No thank you, the wizard said. If it weren't for your research into Wendroth's plans, well, we'd be in a lot more trouble than we already are. The wizard shrugged and gazed at the king. There was fondness there, but it was quickly replaced by a look of concern. The wizard was definitely worried about what he'd seen in the notebook, so at least we had him on our side. All right, that's settled, the king said as he stood up. I should return to the dining hall where I'll be expected. I'm sure there will be many questions about tomorrow's festivities to deal with. After all, it's not every day we hold a wedding. Then I will make my goodbyes here, Rorschach said. I'll need to leave as soon as the knights are ready, so I may not see any of you before then. But don't, I'll wish you good luck tomorrow. And good luck to you, I said. I think you'll need it more than we will. Spoken like a man who has yet to be married, the wizard laughed. The king opened the door and ushered us all out of his office. Since it wasn't the hidden door we'd used before, it took me and the girls a moment to orient ourselves. But Tabitha recovered quickly and started to lead us back to the courtyard. We bade farewell to the king, the doctor, and the wizard at some point, but I barely noticed. I was still thinking about the cipher's horrible fate, and I was worried something similar would befall one of the most valued magicians in Lupercalia. But then again, it seemed like he had both the ring and a small army of Lupercalian knights on his side. So what could possibly go wrong? Chapter 16. The sun in the courtyard of the castle was shining, and for a second I was confused. I could have sworn that the sun had just gone down, and that we'd spent a whole day between New Jersey and Lupercalia making wedding arrangements and trying to negotiate with the king. But for some reason the details seemed fuzzy. I looked around at the stone courtyard and saw that the olive tree was in full bloom. The sky was a bright and harsh blue, and I was wearing red leggings with a red tunic. "Oh no," Tabitha muttered behind me. When I swung around, I saw that Tabitha was hidden behind a large stone column. However, instead of her usual leggings and armor, she was wearing a pink dress that reminded me of Princess Peach. "Tabitha," I asked the blonde noble, "what's wrong? Are you all right?" Oh no, she wailed, and she pointed to the olive tree. I swung around and found that she was perfectly valid in wanting to hide behind a column, because there was her old suitor, who also happened to be the first guy in Lupercalia to piss me off. Good old Hector. The sandy-haired wolf was wearing a bright pink tunic with pink suede leggings, and he let out a haughty laugh that seemed to echo around the entire empty courtyard. Something was making me feel weird and nauseous, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. But I puffed out my chest and decided to face Hector in the middle of the courtyard. "Sir Henry," he seethed as his mouth stretched into a wolfish grin. My, what a surprise it is to see you here in the castle on this beautiful day." "Why would it be a surprise?" I demanded. "I'm a decorated knight now. Answer only to the king and the moon goddess." "And I answer to love," the noble said before bringing both paws to his heart and staring into the sky. "Sir Henry Baker, I answer to the plight of love, for you have taken mine from me." For a second I just stood there and looked at him as he stared directly into the sunlight. What the hell was he going on about? Then I remembered that I was marrying Tabitha, his childhood crush. Clearly, he hadn't taken the news of our impending nuptials very well. "Oh," I said with a nod, and I started to back away from the love-crazed noble. "Well, yeah, looks like I might have done that. But don't worry, Hector. There's plenty of fish in the sea." "The what?" the noble snarled as he turned to glare at me. Okay, to be fair, if someone had thrown me some lame platitude when the woman of my dreams was being married to a dude who had literally fallen from the sky, and then publicly made me eat shit in a joust, I would also be pretty pissed. But that was just the way that this particular cookie had crumbled, and I didn't feel like dealing with a petulant 13-year-old trapped in a man's body. "Come on, man," I said. "Suck it up. You're a grown-ass wolf." "I will not suck anything up," the petty noble seethed, and then he did a weird dance to hide back behind the tree. The whole situation was completely bizarre. I knew that honor was an important aspect of Lupercalian society, but I had no idea that things would be this intense when it came to love. However, if I had to fight for my woman, then there was no way I would shy away from it. After all, I was about to be married, and what kind of Lupercalian husband would I be if I didn't kick some ass in the process? "Hector," I said as I rolled my eyes. "I don't know if this is a Lupercalian thing or what, but nobody is even around except for us." "I'm around," Tabitha said, and she swaggered up in her Princess Peach dress, with 2 dueling swords in hand. "And there is only one way to settle this." "But Tabitha," I said with a laugh, "you already agreed to marry me." "But I have challenged you," Hector said as he leaped out from behind the olive tree for the second time. "I have challenged you to a duel." "No, you didn't," I mumbled under my breath, but this situation was too confusing to comprehend anyway. "You see, Hank," Hector said as he paced around from side to side, "when you stole Tabitha's heart, why, you also stole mine." For a minute, we both went silent while I tried to understand what he was implying. I mean, the dude was dressed in head-to-toe pink and dancing around, so it wasn't totally unthinkable. "Wait, what?" I asked as I wrinkled my brow. "Like, you're into me?" "No way. Dude. I mean, look, I understand, but I just don't swing that way, champ." No, Hector said as he spun a few times on one foot like a ballerina. I'd never known him to be so agile before, and for some reason it was kind of freaking me out. In fact, he kind of reminded me of Mick Jagger on stage, the way his limbs seemed so loose and gangly. But as athletic as the guy suddenly seemed, he still couldn't take me in a fight. "So," I said. "So I meant that you ripped my heart out," he reiterated, and he brought both claws to his chest and mimed the motion of having his heart ripped out. It was a great tragedy. But now, Sir Henry, I will get my revenge. I will slice out your heart with this dueling sword, and it will be the feast at our wedding. Oh, Tabitha, what a beautiful wedding we shall have. Oh no, oh no. Tabitha cried out from the side of the courtyard where she was lying on the ground for some reason with her hand to her forehead like a damsel in distress. Oh, Hank, you couldn't possibly let me marry him. Then why did you hand me such a disaster of a sword? I asked before turning to Hector. Also, you know that these are basically as powerful as a butter knife, right? You're not getting my heart anytime soon. Prepare to die, Sir Henry. Hector screeched, and he started to wave his sword in the air like a swashbuckler in an old black and white movie. Holy shit. This guy was serious. I took a deep breath and braced myself for the fight. The sword was light and flimsy in my hand, but it didn't matter. I knew that I was about to knock the shit out of him with my bare fists if I had to. Poor Hector. This guy just couldn't catch a break, but hell, that wasn't my fault. He was way too big for his fancy little boots. I could feel my hair stand on end as we circled each other in the courtyard. Around the olive tree. He took a few hops to the left, and instead of going in the opposite direction, I followed him. I wanted to kick this guy's ass, and quickly he brought his sword down on mine, and I heard the screech of it echo around the courtyard. Before he could retreat, I swept my sword quickly to the side, and then brought it around toward Hector's chest. Even though he wasn't super coordinated, he wasn't as easy to defeat as I had believed. We kept trading off blows like we were in a stage performance, instead of an actual duel, and for a while, neither of us gained the upper hand. It got to the point where I was practically prancing forward to follow his light-footed movements. I felt like we were ballroom dancing instead of fighting, and I was getting tired of it. Enough of this, I growled as I took another deep breath and braced myself. I hopped to the left and came to a complete standstill before Hector had the time to figure out what my tactic was. He lifted his sword to try and meet mine, but it was too late. I swung my sword into his abdomen and pressed it into his bright pink suede tunic, which became stained with blue blood. A faint gurgling sound passed his lips as he staggered backwards and pulled out the sword. He howled in pain, but his super-fast healing ability meant the wound was already repairing itself. Really, he was just acting like a big baby, but that's all he ever did. Give up, Hector, I growled as the sword clattered to the ground. The echo of the sword signaled me to my victory, and I knew that all hope was lost for my opponent. As if there had been any hope anyway. I mean, he practically turned up with ballet slippers to a gunfight. Curse you, Sir Henry, Hector shouted, and then he sprawled across the cobblestones as his wound knitted together. Oh, come on, Hector, get up, I said, and I went over to him and held out my paw. This guy might have been born into nobility, but I knew that I was the real gentleman here. But just as I held my hand out, I started to hear the clang of bells in the distance. And they weren't just any bells. They were wedding bells. Haiche, Hector said with a devious grin as he sprang up from the ground. Now who will be there to marry your lovely ladies? Shit. He was right. I was late for my own damn wedding. No, I said as I looked into the bright, unforgiving sky. How the hell am I late to my own wedding? I almost cursed the goddess, but I knew that this was somehow my own fault, even though I had no recollection of how I'd even gotten here. Hank, I heard a voice say, though I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I started to feel seasick even though I wasn't on a boat. It was like the ground underneath me was shaking, and it was impossible for me to escape the courtyard because I couldn't walk across the bouncing ground. Wedding day, a child's voice called out from the sky. I looked into the sky but found it was completely black. What? I asked in confusion. I could feel someone shaking me, and as my eyes flew open I saw the ceiling. In my bedroom. No courtyard. No Hector. No Tabitha dressed up as a Super Mario character. I looked down to my left at a young boy who had Charles's eyes. Oliver, stop bothering him, a voice said, and I saw that Charles in his hybrid form, and the direwolf keeper Jacob were dragging a giant wooden chest into the room. A wave of relief came over me. The whole duel with Hector had only been a dream, and so far at least I wasn't late for my wedding. Oh, hello, Charles said as they placed the giant chest on the floor. You don't want to be late for your own wedding, do you? I laughed out loud as Jacob shut the door behind them. We were in for one hell of a day, and I couldn't ask for a better set of Groomsmen to spend. Chapter 17. Wait, I said as I sat up in bed and looked around. I could have sworn that the ladies and I had fallen asleep together after a long day of changing between worlds, but there was no sign that they had been in the room the night before, which wasn't unusual since they were awake before me. Yes, Charles asked as he looked around the room as well. I said as I looked around. Where are? Oh, your wives-to-be, Charles said, and he picked up Oliver, who giggled maniacally. They are getting ready with their families, as is the tradition with Lupercalian households. Ah, I said with a nod. I guess that makes sense. Back where I'm from, the bride and the groom never usually see each other on their wedding day until the ceremony starts. They think it's bad luck. Well, consider it the same here, Charles said with a shrug. Now that I was a little less bleary-eyed, I could see that Charles, Oliver, and Jacob were dressed in what could only be referred to as fancy Lupercalian garb. Oliver was wearing a light blue tunic with black pants and a chainmail vest. Charles was wearing the exact same outfit, though the black was nearly invisible against his fur. Jacob, on the other hand, was wearing a brown tunic with a black stripe down the middle. I'd seen some of the peasants wearing something similar on other special occasion days, and I nodded in approval. Wow, I said. You're all looking at the top of your game, guys. I've selected Jacob to be part of the team that will prepare you for the ceremony, Charles said. As your mentor, I have that privilege. And as someone who has seen the remarkable work he did with Casanova, I knew there was no one else that deserved such a high honor. Thank you, sir, Jacob said with a smile as Oliver ran up and grabbed him by the knees. It is the greatest joy of my life to be in your service, Sir Henry Baker. Oh my, I said as I stretched my arms. Well, Jacob, it's a pleasure to work with you two. You're one of the most talented people on the estate, and not just with the direwolves. But maybe I shouldn't say any more in case Charles tries to lure you away to work at his estate. Jacob blushed at the compliment while Charles laughed and shook his head. The hybrid wolf threw up the lid of the chest like it weighed nothing at all and pawed at whatever was inside with one hand while he tried to keep Oliver out of the chest with the other. Here, my mentor said, and he pulled out a bright blue suede tunic that was covered in precious jewels. It's time to get you ready. Whoa, I said and hopped out of bed. I was only in my boxers, but I suppose it wasn't too weird among the guys. Quickly shook my head back and forth and turned into my hybrid form as the two boys started running around in circles in the room. Oliver, be good, Charles ordered. Oliver looked like he wanted to argue, but Jacob managed to quiet him without any fuss. Maybe he was just as good at corralling children as he was at corralling direwolves, and I thought that maybe he'd be able to exercise some of those skills when Tabitha gave birth to our child. That looks amazing, I said as I ran a hand over the soft fabric of the tunic. Is it yours? This one was not mine, he said. But Lupercalian tradition holds that a knight's clothing is the property of the castle, and only the castle can determine what is appropriate to wear. Like the armor, I mused. Yes, like the armor, Charles agreed. And marriage is simply one of the steps every knight must take along his life's path. Not that I'm trying to downplay marriage. It is a very important part of a man's life, especially for a nobleman. It's so important to ensure that there are future generations of werewolves. It's a duty, I said. It is, he said and smiled. Though the happiest one most of us will make. Don't underestimate the importance of a good wife. I don't think either Tabitha or Sybil will ever let that happen, I laughed. But if the shirt isn't yours? As I was saying, the clothing for all the important moments in your life are from the castle and the king. It is a way to connect you to the generations of knights that have come before. I'm honored, I said as I took the tunic from him. And here's the bottoms, he said with a laugh as he pulled a pair of shiny silver pants from the chest. I pulled on both articles of clothing before fishing around for some socks. Do I get dress shoes? I asked as I cocked an eyebrow. Sorry, what are those? Charles asked with a laugh. It must be an American phrase, I said with a shrug. Dress shoes are like fancy shoes that you only wear on special occasions. No, that kind of thing is only for women here, he said with a shrug. My mother would be very disappointed if she heard that, I said with a grin. I pulled on my old sturdy boots and saw that the servants had polished them up to a good presentable shine. I sauntered over to the mirror and took a look at myself. Holy shit, I looked awesome. The light of the early morning sun made the gemstones and metal on my outfit sparkle, so I looked like I was one of the most decorated knights in Lupercalia, and I had to admit it felt pretty damn good to be glitzed up. Charles, I said as a wolfish grin spread across my face, I think we've done. I look completely and utterly awesome. You do, he said with a laugh. And I can't wait to present you to the servants. But there's something else that must be done first. Jacob and Charles exchanged a nod, and the animal handler went over to the wooden chest. What is it? I asked with a laugh. Sit down for a moment, Charles said, and he guided me back to the bed. I sat down with some hesitation as Jacob produced a tiny tin box. When he opened it, there was a small vial of some herbal tincture as well as a silver ring and a large needle. Oh, I murmured. I felt a chill up my spine when I remembered that the girls had told me that Lupercalian men had their ears pierced when they got married. I knew it wasn't a big deal, but for someone who wasn't fond of needles and had never even considered body piercings or tattoos before, it was a heart-stopping moment. It won't hurt, Charles reminded me as he lifted his eyebrow. Remember that. You have superior healing powers, so you'll barely feel even a pinch. You're right, I said. I watched as he poured some of the tincture on some cotton wool and swept it over my ear. I smelled peppermint, and a moment later I realized that it had numbed my ear. Just give me that, Charles said to Jacob as he took the large needle and the beautiful moon-silver earring from him. Now this won't hurt a bit. I'm sure it won't, I sighed. It's just a little needle, right? Nothing to be scared of. But you know, where you're in battle there's so much adrenaline that you just don't even care if someone is coming for you with a massive sword, and so you don't really think about, yuch. I felt a sharp burning pinch in my ear that disappeared in about 10 seconds. I saw Charles step back and check his work, and then he nodded to Oliver and Jacob. That's some fine handiwork, I'd say, wouldn't you boys? Charles chuckled. It's perfect, Jacob replied. Hank, this makes it official. You're a married man. Well, almost, Charles said. You still have to go through the ceremony. Does it look okay? I asked as I squinted at the mirror. Here, have a look, Charles replied as he handed the needle box to me. The inside of the lid was polished and flat, so it was just as good as a mirror. I held it up to my ear and saw that the dark fur was now punctuated by a beautiful glittering moon silver earring that sparkled in the morning light. Whoa, I said with a laugh. I think I'm really swagged out now. I have no idea what that means, Charles said. But I'm sure you are swagged out. And remember that this isn't just to look good. This article of jewelry will now stay on you at all times to remind you of your devotion to the moon goddess, and your role as a protector to your burgeoning family. Of course, I said with a nod. I suddenly felt my spirits lift as fire raced through my body, and I couldn't wait to get to the castle and marry my ladies. I'd come so far already, and now I was taking one of the most important steps any man could take. I was going to be a protector of Lupercalia, protector of my family, and protector of my business. Things were going damn well and I couldn't wait. Let's show the servants, Charles suggested. There was a lot of laughing and backslapping as Charles opened the door and we strode into the hallway. Our voices carried throughout the house, so it wasn't a surprise when we reached the balcony overlooking the entryway and found most of the house staff as well as Jacob's family gathered below. There he is, someone shouted as the rest of the crowd started to cheer. Hey, I laughed and then waved awkwardly like the prom king I felt like. Sir Henry is to be married. The servants shouted and danced around. It seemed so crazy that these people I'd really only just met could get so excited about my marriage, but their happiness was infectious. I shot a look at Charles before I ran down the stairs and joined the celebration. Here, Martha said, and she shoved a cup of moonbeam brew in my hand. Just harvested. For good luck. Thanks, I laughed as I took the mug. I tilted my head back and let the warm, inviting liquid make its way down my gullet into my belly. I felt like all of my nerve endings were on fire and I was elated that I was about to go to my own wedding. Sir Henry, Charles said into my ear, I believe that there are more waiting outside for you. Holy crap. I was expecting a wedding to be fun, but after literally one day of it being royally decreed, I wasn't exactly expecting a parade. Still, when the others opened the door, I was shocked to find the rest of the peasants from the estate standing at the entrance. And that wasn't even the best thing. One of the servants let out Casanova with a long pink piece of rope. I didn't even know that we had any pink rope, but I assumed that they dyed it with the beetroot harvest that took place every fall. The pup had been covered in the girl's favorite flowers from the estate. The large black dog looked like the backdrop of a night sky, punctuated by tens if not hundreds of red, pink, and yellow roses, hyacinths, and daisies. I was taken aback as Prometheus popped out from behind his ear with a large pink bow tied around his neck. Both of the animals wagged their tongues at me like they knew exactly what was going on, and I had to practically fight back tears at how beautiful everything was. Oh my! I laughed at the servants and the animals. This is absolutely gorgeous. What an effort you've all made. Give a speech, Charles whispered into my ear. But what do I say? I asked. Do I just thank them for the decorations or for, well, everything? It's typical for a nobleman to give a speech before his own community, one that expresses how important they are to him. Charles shrugged. That's just the Lupercalian way. I can do that, I replied and turned back to the crowd. Just like Jacob, they were all wearing brown tunics with a large stripe in the middle, and all of the dirt and the mulch from farming had been washed off of their faces. Some of the little girls had ribbons in their hair, and the men were wearing silver pendants with rings on them. I assumed that they were wedding rings because they were all too busy in the fields to ever really wear their jewelry, and it made sense that they would keep the rings on a chain rather than risk losing it in the dirt of the field. Hey guys, I said, and a few of them exchanged glances. I mean, noble subjects of the Baker estate. It's such an honor to have such hard-working people around me all the time, and you're all awesome. I know your work on the estate makes it possible for me to go off on quests for the kingdom. I looked at Charles, who motioned his hand as if to ask me to say more. Now say something about your wedding, he whispered. And the moon goddess. Oh, I said and nodded. And I'm so excited to not only be the head of this estate, but I will be joined in matrimony and will now be the head of a household in service to the moon goddess. After all, I have the moon goddess to thank for everything. Everything that you see is part of the gift that the moon goddess bestowed upon me. I am her loyal subject, and I vow to serve the goddess in every way I can. Hear, hear, my mentor shouted. Hear, hear, the peasants shouted in return, and they laughed and slapped each other on the back. It's time, Charles whispered and nodded toward my direwolf. I took a deep breath and then started down the steps. I could feel the joy of my people as I walked through the crowd, and I even touched a few of the kids on the forehead like I had seen Imelda do when she offered a blessing. That seemed to make everyone ecstatic, so I was grinning when I finally reached my ride. Casanova gave me a quick lick before I slid onto his back as carefully as I could, though I did manage to knock a couple of flowers onto the ground. Prometheus turned around and oinked at me as soon as I was in my saddle, and the piglet even jumped a little bit to show how happy he was. Hey you, I said with a laugh as I patted the piglet on the head. You know, it's not a bad life you lead. Battle weddings. I'd be pretty happy to be a pig in your position. Prometheus oinked a few more times, and his nose wiggled with excitement. Thought back to how much Tabitha wanted to eat him and reminded myself that he really did have a great life as a pig. 1 in a million, in fact. Another servant brought out Bertie, who yawned a few times and licked his lips, like he'd seen this all before. Charles shook his head at his old mount before he helped Jacob and Oliver onto the direwolf's back and then climbed on himself. Come on, old boy, Charles laughed as he patted Bertie on the back. I tightened my grip around Casanova's reins, because I knew that it was time for us to make our way to the castle. But before I could nudge him, Charles held out his hand to stop me. He said as he wagged his finger. We don't run on our wedding day. When you return to the estate, all of the petals will be dispersed in the air behind you to help fertilize the fields that you must pass. But on your way to the wedding, we walk to the castle so that others may wish you luck as we ride by. Walk? I asked as I raised an eyebrow. But surely that will take, I don't know, an hour or so. Yes, he laughed. But the girl's journey will also take a while. Tabitha will take a carriage to the castle as befits her station. And what about Sybil? I asked with a twinge of concern. Is she getting a carriage? The peasant tradition is a little different, he said as his brow furrowed in thought. Usually the peasants with witchcraft in their family meet in the exact middle between their houses, and are married wherever in the village. That may be. Some of them choose to marry in temples, but in Sybil's case she would have chosen the former route. However, since you are to be married in the palace by decree, her family will be making a pilgrimage. My goddess, I said to myself and tried not to roll my eyes. I had no idea it would be this complicated. Well, I guess we should go if we want to be there before sunset. Charles nudged Bertie forward, and Casanova started to walk alongside the older direwolf. Even though it was going to take a hell of a long time to get to the palace at this pace, I decided to relax and enjoy it. It was my wedding day after all, not a race. Something about being in my hybrid form and riding to the castle at such a leisurely pace made me feel more present than ever. As we made our way out of the moonbeam fields into the green hills and dales of Lupercalia, I was aware of each and every scent that we passed in a way I rarely was. The smell of moonbeams turned into the fresh dew on the grass and the wildflowers that dotted the countryside. Sunlight gave everything a golden glow, and even the mud in the fields looked charming. It was a truly beautiful day for a wedding. As soon as we left the estate, I started to hear a low humming sound from behind me, and I realized that the peasants were swaying as they followed us with their songs. This is beautiful, I sighed. It is, Charles agreed. A perfect day to get married. You've really been blessed by the moon goddess with this one. I looked up into the sky and laughed at how blue and shining everything was. Oh really? I asked with a laugh. So the moon goddess even controls the sun? You'd be surprised at how much power the moon has over the sun, Charles said. But you'll find out a great deal more of that when you're married. The Lupercalians had never mentioned a sun god or anything similar, and I wondered if there even was another deity that served as a foil to the goddess. Every religion I knew about usually had some bad or evil god who could wreak havoc whenever the humans got too lackadaisical, but the moon goddess seemed to have such a powerful and peaceful reign that it was easy to believe that she was truly the only deity in the land. The tinkle of bells sounded from behind us and woke me from my reverie. Charles didn't even seem to notice, but I glanced over my shoulder and saw that the servants had brought out small sleigh bells and hide-covered instruments that looked like tambourines. They played them rhythmically to our steps as we walked through the fields. I was taken aback by the beauty of the day. Sure, Windroth's journal was under investigation by Rorschach, and there was some kind of danger that we'd have to face. But I was reminded of everything we'd already been through as well. I'd gained friends, lovers, and a great team, and surely the closer we grew meant that we would be more powerful than ever. Daddy, look, Oliver said, and the chubby-fisted kid lifted his hand and pointed into the distance. Charles winked at me and then laughed when he saw my expression. I thought that the procession outside my house was something special, but this was next level. The castle was like all of the excitement on my private moon bean estate, but on crack. There were blue, white, and yellow flags fluttering from all the turrets, and all of the nobility had gathered on the drawbridge to welcome us. Couldn't believe that everyone in the kingdom would gather for my wedding at such short notice, but the marriage of Sir Henry Baker of New Jersey was clearly the event of the season. I studied the faces that I could see, but there was no sign of the girls in the crowd. I was a little disappointed, even though I knew that I probably wouldn't see them until the ceremony. I sighed, but that small disappointment wouldn't ruin my day. Trumpets sounded as we approached the castle, and my hair stood on end. Could hear the murmur of voices as well, and smell the various perfumes and soaps. There were a lot of people in attendance, and I would have to stand up in front of all of them to give my vows. If I was going to panic at any point, this was it. But I took a deep breath and thought about my parents. They had been so happy together, and that was all they'd ever wanted for me and Ava. They would have been happy to see me marrying such wonderful women, and I knew then that I wouldn't disappoint them. Look, Oliver shouted again and pointed at one of the squires. There, wearing the same colors as you. The squires were indeed wearing blue velvet suits with puffy sleeves and blue leggings. Their hats were yellow and pointed, which I had realized was their special occasion wear. But it wasn't just the squires who were dressed to match me. The women of the nobility wore blue dresses with a yellow sash in varying styles, and the men all wore blue suede tunics with yellow leggings. Why don't they wear armor? I asked. Back in the States, men who serve in the army to protect the country usually wear their uniforms. I assumed it would be the same here. Here in Lupercalia, we like to think that the wedding is a sacred and ordained day, Charles said. It is to be a day of peace, especially when those who are being wed are the nobles who will spend the rest of their lives fighting to defend the land. Therefore we do not wear our armor. Instead, it is one of the few days when we decorate ourselves and resign the day to luxury. That's why you're in such heavy clothing. You couldn't jump into battle if you tried. I guess the castle isn't frequently under attack, but isn't that kind of risky? I laughed. Not under the power of the moon goddess, Charles shrugged as we approached the crowd. I know that the king said that he didn't know the exact power of what would happen if you broke a royal decree, but the royal decree is a prayer within itself. There has never been an attack on the day of a noble wedding that has been granted by royal decree, and that is why it is so sacred. That's some serious power, I said in a more somber voice. Indeed it is, Charles replied. So you don't need to worry, young pup. Nothing will happen during your wedding, unless you try to make a run for it. I laughed and Charles soon joined it. The sound joined the voices of the peasants behind us and the nobles ahead of us. It was a moment of pure happiness and I let myself soak it in. When we were nearly to the drawbridge, the nobles spread apart and formed a long line on either side of us that led straight to the olive tree in the courtyard. The tree had a silver glow despite the sunlight, and the scent of warm olives drifted over the gathering. Everyone make way for Sir Henry Baker, who is to be married under the blessings of the moon goddess. One of the guards barked. Casanova and I started across the drawbridge, and Charles followed behind us. It took me a moment to realize that the peasants weren't crossing the bridge, and when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw that they had stopped in the fields and looked to be setting up a small camp. What? I whispered to my mentor. There isn't enough room for everyone inside the castle walls, Charles whispered back. Not with all the nobles here. But don't worry, there will be plenty of food and drink sent out to them, and they'll be alerted as soon as the ceremony is completed. We reached the other side of the drawbridge and came to a stop by the olive tree. I scanned the faces again, but there was still no sign of either of my girls. In fact, the only person who stepped forward was Dromgoole, who bowed before he offered a salute. Sir Henry Baker, you will make your way to the castle chapel, the squire said, and he pointed to the left, where there was yet another large arch. Don't worry, I know where we're going, Charles whispered. Should we dismount? I asked. Not yet, Charles replied. As we rode through the arch, there were even more nobles to greet us. But what caught my eye was that we seemed to be in one of the oldest sections of the castle. There were high, half-ruined arches that looked like they'd been there for hundreds of years and crumbling stonework that was slowly being reclaimed by the ivy. At the center of it all was a simple brick structure that towered over us, though it no longer had a roof. Pieces of old stained glass windows jutted up from piles of debris like knives, and the symbol of the moon goddess had been carved above the door, though the stone was so weathered that the moon was barely visible anymore. This is incredible, I said as I turned around to Charles. What happened here? Struck by lightning, he replied. It was during the reign of a king who failed to follow through with one of his commitments to the moon goddess. She wasn't very amused, and the chapel ceiling burst into flames one day when he was inside it. She would destroy her own building? I asked in surprise. Of course, he said. The king had to be warned, and besides, it looks much nicer now, don't you think? I looked at the bare skeleton of a chapel, which had vines and flowers growing around it. Even though it had been broken, it was indeed beautiful. It's beautiful, I agreed. When we reached the entrance, I noticed Imelda was already in place at a large white marble basin. She wore a long yellow dress with a blue stripe down the middle, but even that heavy dress couldn't conceal the fact that she was glowing with happiness. Sir Henry, an unfamiliar squire said as he took Casanova's reins, you must now approach the altar on your own and wait for your wives-to-be to arrive in the chapel. I nodded and started to slide off when Prometheus emerged from Casanova's fur and oinked at me. Wish me luck, buddy, I murmured to the piglet as my feet hit the ground. For a moment the world seemed to wobble, so I took a deep breath and closed my eyes. I couldn't believe I was about to get married, but I knew it was the right thing to do. I heard Casanova pad away as the squire led him to the side of the chapel, and then there was nothing but silence. I opened my eyes and turned to look at the gathered crowd, But my attention was caught by the sound of trumpets from the walls. I could feel the crowd's anticipation as they all turned toward the archway, and then a large blue carriage pulled by a direwolf rolled into view, announcing the soon-to-be wives of Sir Henry Baker of New Jersey. A squire's voice called out above the whispers and rustling of fabric. I really liked the way that sounded.